Today I have for you a blitz encounter between two legendary world champions, Mikhail Tal, the 8th world champion, and Anatoly Karpov, the 12th world champion. A genuine battle between legends that just leaves you gaping after the cinematic sacrifice of two rooks. This game took place in 1987. Mikhail Tal starts things off with pawn to e4, grabbing control of the center. Anatoly Karpov responds with pawn to c6, setting up to later challenge the center with pawn to d5. White continues with pawn to c4. On the board, we have the Caro-Can defense. White's concept here is that after pawn to d5, which indeed happens in the game, Karpov strikes at the center with this advance. White captures, and following the recapture, we see an exchange of 4 pawns. Once black removes white's pawn on d5, white ends up with an isolated pawn on the d-file but receives in compensation a central pawn and excellent piece activity. Karpov brings out his kingside knight to f6 and wants to capture on d5 specifically with this knight, because on a queen capture, white could develop the knight to c3 with tempo. Tal develops knight to c3, and after the capture on d5, brings out his kingside knight to f3, permitting black to take on c3 if he chooses. The 12th world champion, well aware of Mikhail Tal's sharp attacking approach, chooses to trade one pair of knights. Knight takes c3, white recaptures with the b-pawn. True, white certainly gets the pawn center after pawn to d4, but with one fewer pair of knights on the board. Black plays pawn to g6, fianchettoing the dark-squared bishop along the long diagonal. White plays pawn to d4, seizing the center. Now he can bring out the light-squared bishop and castle. Black develops bishop to g7, and after bishop to d3, black finishes developing the king side by castling, tucking the king away safely. Safe for now, at least. White wastes no time and also castles. The black knight emerges to c6. White possesses his pawn center, while the black bishop on g7 has an excellent view across the board. White's pawns remain constantly within its range. Tal brings his rook to the e-file with rook to e1. Black mirrors with rook to e8. On the next move, black already plans to break with pawn to e5, undermining white's central structure. Tal, developing his final minor piece, plays bishop to g5, pinning black's pawn on e7 to the queen on d8. Now pawn to e5 isn't so straightforward to execute. Black needs to address the problem of the bishop on c8. Along the long light diagonal, it cannot easily develop since too much time would be needed for pawn to b6 and then bishop to b7. In this position, Karpov decides to place his bishop on e6. Certainly, it would also have been reasonable to play bishop to g4, pinning white's knight on f3, and then later, perhaps after a queen move, prepare pawn to e5, using the fact that white's knight is pinned. However, in the game, Karpov selects bishop to e6. The concept behind this move is that next move he can position his bishop on the long light diagonal. Apparently, Karpov simply forgot that sitting across from him is Mikhail Tal. Rook takes on e6. Black recaptures with the f-pawn. But now, without the light-squared bishop, white gains the advantage of the two bishops, and especially the powerful light-squared bishop, which now has no easy challenger. White's bishop comes to c4, already threatening to capture the pawn on e6, forcing black to defend. Queen to d6, centralizing the queen while also protecting the pawn on e6. Queen to e2. White continues building pressure along the e-file on that e6 pawn. The black knight retreats to d8, defending the pawn on e6. But with rook to e1, defenders of the pawn on e6 are insufficient for black, and moving the king to f7 is completely undesirable. Black brings his last inactive piece into play with rook from a8 to c8. The rook begins operating along the c-file, eyeing the bishop and the pawn on c3. In this position for white, the critical thing is remembering his strategic objective. Having sacrificed the exchange on e6 for the bishop, white obtained tremendous initiative along with that light-squared bishop. Therefore, simply giving away that bishop by taking the pawn on e6 would be unprofitable. After capturing on e6, numerous exchanges would follow, including capture on c3. And what would remain for white? White would simply be down the exchange.
He would have a knight against black's rook. The position would be losing. Consequently, Mikhail Nehemyevich Tal's strategic idea here is precisely to attack the black king. And the best way to accomplish this is with knight to d2. Tal transfers the knight into the center toward e4, also supporting his bishop on c4. Black responds with king to h8, stepping away from all X-ray threats from the bishop toward the pawn on e6. The knight arrives on e4, attacking the queen. Black's queen withdraws, also threatening to capture the bishop on c4. The bishop steps back to b3, and Black attempts to untangle his position. He strikes in the center with pawn to e5, attempting to disrupt White's central pawn structure. And once again for White, the essential thing in this position is not to play for material, not to attempt defending the pawn on d4, which Black threatens to capture twice and win. White must continue following his plan, which Tal does. He plays pawn to h4, trying to crack open Black's defensive shell on the king side. Black captures the pawn on d4, but pawn to h5 follows. White's pawn march continues toward the Black king, and in this position, Karpov begins to falter. He captures with the g-pawn on h5. Well, better in this position would have been, for instance, queen to b6, thereby connecting the queen to the defense. Now, upon capture, simply recapture with the queen, and the queen here would excellently defend the Black king. But instead comes pawn takes on h5. Already, Tal also makes a slight inaccuracy and plays in human fashion. He captures with queen takes on h5. The optimal move in this position would certainly have been a rather inhuman move, knight to f6. In blitz, at least, such a move is extremely difficult to find. The point is that this knight cannot be captured. For instance, if bishop takes on f6, White captures with bishop with check. Black is compelled to take this bishop, otherwise it's mate. But then White captures the rook, the undefended rook, on e8. But if capturing with the pawn, then all the same. First, White captures the rook, and then immediately delivers mate to the Black king. Upon blocking with the bishop after the capture, White takes this bishop, and it's mate to the Black king. But if this knight isn't taken after knight to f6, something must be done, for White is attacking the Black rook on e8, and upon the rook's retreat follows yet another sacrifice. The knight captures on h7, sacrificing itself and completely destroying Black's kingside defenses. After the knight is captured, there follows a beautiful mate. In this manner, the game could have concluded already here. But Mikhail Tal plays in a more human fashion. He captures with queen takes on h5, attacking the rook on e8. The rook is forced to retreat to f8, connecting the rook along the f-file to the king's defense. But now comes bishop to c2. White's bishop will assume a more active attacking role. Threats of discovered knight jumps begin appearing. For instance, also knight to f6, with mating threats from the queens supported by the bishop. Black must defend with queen to e5, centralizing the queen and tying down White's pieces. Now the bishop cannot move, since behind it hangs the queen on h5, and the knight also cannot move, since behind it hangs the rook on e1 with check. But nothing alarming, thinks Mikhail Tal. He plays knight to g3. The second White rook is sacrificed, this time a complete rook. In this way, White attempts to divert the Black queen from defending its king. And it's not as though Black has any alternative. The queen has nowhere to retreat while remaining close to the king's side. The entire point of knight to g3 is that White opens his light-squared bishop and already now threatens mate in one move with queen takes on h7. Therefore, it's necessary to capture this rook with check. Queen takes on e1 check. White's king is forced to retreat, and Black's checks are exhausted. Still, there remains the threat of mate in one, queen to h7. In this position, Black had only one saving move to discover, the inhuman resource bishop to h6, offering White some material, sacrificing his bishop. But whichever way White captures here, if for example taking with the bishop, then follows rook to f7. The rook is defended by the knight from d8. Thus, the rook along the 7th rank protects its king. The pawn on h7 is defended. But if, for example, capturing this bishop with the queen, then also rook to f7, protecting the pawn on h7. White here simply lacks sufficient material and the entire attack collapses. But in the game, this didn't occur. The move wasn't discovered. Black played pawn to h6 in human fashion, attempting to block the mate. But now follows bishop takes on h6. The black king is forced to flee, since if capturing, then comes once again mate in several moves. And now, after king to g8, white captures the bishop on g7. Black captures on f2, attempting to counterattack by attacking the bishop on c2. But white's mate is more powerful. White delivers check with queen to h7. The only retreat for the king is king to f7, and queen to g6 follows. King to g8, bishop to h6 check. With this move, black resigned, because after the only move which the king has to h8, Tal would deliver a beautiful mate on h8 or g7. With such a breathtaking attack, the 8th world champion Mikhail Tal defeated the 12th world champion Anatoly Karpov. Tal was wild for his brilliant sacrifices and his top-notch moves. But is there another more like Tal, more aggressive, more daring, and even more attack-minded than he was? Watch this video over here right now to find out. But just before you go, please leave a like if you enjoyed this game, and don't forget to support the channel by subscribing. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.